Welcome to the Commercial Edge podcast with me, Chris Webber. Come and enjoy a virtual coffee while I share my experience and ideas that could help you overcome difficult people at work. I share my thinking and insights so that you can find new ways to overcome challenges and gain a commercial edge and unleash the power of people. Welcome to a special episode of the Commercial Edge podcast. Today I'm very proud that we've got an amazing panel sitting around me, and we're going to have a group conversation about leadership and overcoming difficult challenges in leadership, and particularly challenging situations. So let's go around the table, do a quick introduction so you know who's here.
My name is Andy Tarnay and I consult companies and help them to grow faster.
My name's Chris Shearer-Wright and I head up the ED&I function at Oliver Bonus.
My name is Joe Perry. I'm an independent HR consultant and just published a book called Collective ER with co-authors Debbie Sanders and Richard Saundry.
I'm Jo Keeler and I'm the Managing Director at Belbin. We help teams work better together.
I'm Julie Shapiro. I'm a CEO and founder of Shapiro Consulting. I too help teams work better together. It's a great thing to be able to do by building the behaviours and relationships that help them get what they want.
Hi, I'm Tony Belgrave. I head up Positive Deviant and I specialise in working with high-performing teams, working with leaders in particular who are transitioning into new roles.
Hi, I'm Kelly Peter and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Hearst Networks EMEA.
Beautiful. So I'm going to start by posing a scenario, and I'd love to get a conversation going around the table on how you would deal with the situation. So I'd like to base it around a parent who's come back from parental leave. Let's just leave it at that for right now. It doesn't matter. And you start to notice that this parent who's come back seems much less engaged in the business. So used to be an active contributor in meetings, now seems a little bit more reserved, doesn't seem to be as energetic and committed as you've seen in the past. And so you're starting to notice that level of enthusiasm drop away. And so now I'm just curious as well, how might you deal with that? How might you engage with this person? What's on your mind as you're connecting with this personality? How would you start a conversation? Would you want to start a conversation?
A few considerations I might make is establish what sort of element of pre-onboarding or welcome back to the business, welcome back to the brand that person's line manager has implemented for them. Are they excited to come back? Are they anxious? Do they have parental guilt for coming back to work? Is it of a necessity? And establish what those conversations have looked like first, before it becoming an issue with that person individually, I think.
I really like that. And do you know what? I know lots of companies who do phased return to work, but I don't know any that do what you've just described. Tell me more about what that is, Chris.
Well, within Oliver Bonus, we run through a colleague of mine who's amazing, a sort of confident comebacks workshop for people returning from parental leave, and she has really revolutionised what that looks like for returning parents. They've really seen. They've become really excited about coming back to work, really energised, but also it provides a bit of a space for people who aren't feeling so great about it, or like I said, that pending parental guilt, or what that could look like as well. So I think that there is a real we try to put an emphasis on you're coming back. We can't wait to see you. How are you feeling about that?
That's really interesting. Kelly, like you were about to respond during that. I'm curious where your thoughts were.
I really love that, the confident comeback. We have a really good policy at Hearst with the phased return, as you just mentioned, where we allow mothers and fathers, we do parental leave as well, to come back, whether it's 4 days a week or, at a reduced schedule. Up to them, really, for a couple of months. And that's really what it's all about. We understand that it's a challenge, that it's coming back, and it's different for everyone, isn't it? So the conversations need to happen, and to understand how people feel. And I think going back to your question, it starts with the conversation. Do the investigation, have the evidence from a performance perspective, but have that conversation with the person directly. Ask them if they're okay. Start there.
Has anyone dealt with that? Let's stay for this scenario, then it's a bit of parental guilt. How do you deal with parental guilt? Someone says to you, I just feel really terrible. I'm leaving my son or daughter and I just feel awful about that right now. Something you can do about it or not?
When you first said that, I thought, have any of you experienced parental guilt? I thought, well, I've experienced parental guilt. I was wondering whether you were asking us whether we've experienced it. But that is an important point in terms of empathy and understanding. And when you pose this challenge, Chris, actually one of the first things that came to my mind, because I agree a conversation is really important, and I went back a step. I wondered, what's my relationship with this person right now?
Yeah.
How safe or trusting does this relationship feel?
Mm-hmm.
So my go-to would be to go into a conversation with compassion, with curiosity, and with courage, because it might feel a sensitive conversation to be having. And how I feel around courage and all those other things is shaped by what I'm starting with in this conversation. Is this a different conversation to one that we've ever had before?
Yeah.
So if I ask those questions, how are you? What do you need? I may or may not get a useful, helpful for either of us response, depending on where we are. So I'm also managing my expectations based on our starting point.
Tony, I'm going to bring you in because you're nodding along there.
Yeah, I was just nodding. Yeah, I think I do relate to that. I think the foundation of all great leadership is trust. And I think that if I hadn't had much of a relationship with this individual beforehand, I'm in danger of sounding inauthentic. They'll question, what are my motivations most probably. And so, yeah, really considering what the starting point of the relationship is, I think is really important. I'm also carrying this idea as well, though, that leadership is also about creating ease for my team. Relationship aside, if I am a good leader, I'll be concerned with what's getting in the way of you, bringing your best. And because my job is really to create ease for you so that you could do really well. But again, it all hinges on, what was the quality of the relationship before? Am I likely to be seen as inauthentic if I start asking these questions based on the fact that I haven't really invested much to begin with? So yeah, I agree. Depends on your starting point.
And that poses the question of where's the focus? So my focus is you're coming back to work and I want you engaged because there's a job to do.
Yeah.
Or you're coming back to work and I'm worried about you as a human being, but is that my business? And I guess that comes to the trust question. Thoughts on that?
They're two halves of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we are whole people. We are people that contribute and to performance. And we are also humans and people with emotions and lives outside of work. And I think the strongest leaders, the most impactful leaders are those that approach people as whole.
Yeah.
I was just going to come in. In the preamble, Tony mentioned about high-performing teams. And individuals don't come back into one relationship. They come back into a web of relationships.
Yeah,
and if that trust exists on a one-to-one level, there's a degree of trust. It's on a continuum on a one-to-one level. And then there's a series of other one-to-one levels and a collective level. And as a leader, have you fostered an environment where there is the ability to have open, transparent conversations to raise issues, and then for the collective to help find a solution to that. And that creates an environment where people will, I would hope, be more willing to raise concerns, challenges, because they know that those around them will help out to find a solution, whether it's flexibility, whether it's on how long you work or when you work. Some of the teams I've worked in, there's been a strong sense of that actually your colleagues have got your back, and that really helps.
Yeah.
There's all of those different relationships, which is what makes it all really difficult, I suppose.
And I wonder if that's partly the difficulty of I'm coming back into a team and I'm no longer the same personality I was when I left, because I've been changed by parenthood, and am I up to the standards of my team? And that might be fueling some of their sense of guilt. Parental guilt might be, well, if that's the amount of energy and effort I need to commit to my job because that's what I used to do, that's going to take away from my family situation.
I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? When you look at the team as a whole, is that if the team are there to still achieve their work, to still hit their targets, their objectives, then it's the team's responsibility for that person to come back and to feel that they are part of that team. And I think very often we talk about leadership, we feel that leaders need to have every conversation, have every answer. And it could be part of that leadership, is there somebody better placed within that team to have that conversation and to be able to give that to somebody else within the team, because it's going to foster a far better outcome. So we don't have to always, or the leader doesn't have to always be the one leading. Part of that leadership is by acknowledging that there are other strengths and other people who can have those conversations just as well.
Yeah. It brings to mind actually this term that I once heard that I find helpful, called leaderful teams. And it's the idea that it isn't always a leader who has to be doing the doing. There are equally other people in the team who are capable, just like you're saying. But, that idea of a leaderful team where people could step into and be what's needed for any given moment is a really powerful thing.
Andy?
Yeah, I've been listening to the points, and particularly Chris's project. I'm looking at this, is this a leadership question or is it an organizational question? Because you might manage a team of people, might have 5-10 direct reports, and the person who's coming back has, as we said, different challenges. They might sleep less, they might have had some hormonal changes, they might have guilt, there might be so many elements. So for a leader, for the line manager, having to deal with that, in addition to having maybe budget pressure, developing, getting sales over the line, might be quite a lot. But if you proactively recognize that as an organization and build that into the process, and don't expect that person on the day when they come back to be the same person, because it's going to be a process. Maybe they will get used to not seeing that little one so much. I think it's an organizational process rather than a leadership challenge to address that and give that person the opportunity to find their own path. So I'm not sure if that sits with a line manager entirely. I actually think it's an organizational question.
Well, and I want to come back to Chris, who started this, because you said that you have people who facilitate these things. So that's not the line manager. And that's an interesting element, because Tony commented on trust and, do I have the trust and the right to that relationship? And then you're introducing perhaps a new person into that relationship. And I'm just curious how that works. And then in the context of what Andy said, that's like it's an organizational approach to that.
And I think that so much of what that really relies on, as to what Gilly said, is that established trust and that established relationship in the first place. Like, someone's got to feel comfortable coming to a workshop facilitated by someone else in the team. There has to be relationships built there, and we do really work very hard at creating that community aspect. So one of our ERGs is a parent and carers network, our voices networks we call them, and I said colleague earlier on, I should shout her out. Her name's Ash. She does a brilliant job at facilitating that workshop, and she also leads our parent and carers voices network as well. But it is about having that network to retransition back into work. I think that, pre being a parent, you probably were able to, burn the midnight oil a little bit more and work later, and there might be more established boundaries there with, I have to finish at 5 because if I don't pick up my child at a certain time, the nursery might charge me, or all of those other implications, or not even financial implications, but just wanting to have that time with your child when you finish the day as well. So I agree with you completely, Andy, when you said it's an organisational. I don't think it's an organisational problem. I actually think it's an organisational responsibility to create that space.
I'm not 100%. So I love what you both said, and I think it's both.
Yeah.
I really do, because as we've been having this conversation, one of the things that comes through to me is somebody coming in, might be back into the team or coming new into a team. It's a new team. It is a completely new team. So what do we do as a leader when we have a new team? You pay attention to drawing the team together and building those relationships. If somebody has stepped out for a number of months and is coming back in, it's a new team. Yeah.
I'm curious on your thoughts here, Joe, because this is very much in your models too, and I'm curious, how would you have a scenario built in for people? Like, how would you bring in a return to work scenario?
Well, I've just sort of written down, and it's really interesting listening to everybody's perspectives, but we're all taking it on the fact that the person returning to work is the one who's changed. But actually, going back to it's a new team, we don't know what has changed in the 6 months, year, however long they've been away, is that we can't just click our fingers and the trust returns. So perhaps it is, doing that more gradual return and not making any assumptions. I think sometimes we make too many assumptions on both sides. It's the same as it was, somebody's just returning. And we need to question those. And we do need to start from the beginning. You should always, whenever anything changes within a team, is when you should stop, take check of where you are, what the objectives are, the people and everything else, and use it as a good time to just reassess. But to assume that one person's changed and the team hasn't is perhaps slightly naive.
I wonder if there's a moment to reflect also on just thinking about the team, what environment exists. So let's take this a stage on. So you have a conversation with them. They say, yes, I feel a bit of guilt. I don't feel as though I'm as committed to the team as I was before. That's worrying me about this. Does it say something about your culture? Is it a trigger for you in terms of the expectations you have for your group? It's interesting listening to you, Chris, and you talk about Oliver Bonus, and some of the stuff you do is amazing around inclusivity and being open-minded to different perspectives. Not many organisations are like that. I think of the organisations I came through, it was very much perform or get out. And there was no flexibility. And so, is it reflective of the culture you're in? And is there an opportunity for management leaders to kind of go, look, if we're struggling with engagement from new parents, should we look at that? What should we do?
Ask the question again, Chris, please.
So as a leader, you're noticing you've got somebody who comes back in. It's now a trigger for you to say, well, actually, we've got someone here who's coming back in, childhood guilt, and when we've had a conversation, they worry about their performance level. They worry about being able to go back into what they did before. Now, is that because it's them or is it us? Is it what we expect from people that's the problem?
It's clearly it's a big assumption. That person has gone away, comes back, let's say, after 12 months. The business might have changed, but also assuming that person can do the same thing, the same time, the same enthusiasm, that assumption is a big assumption. If you look at the longer term as a business, if you help that person to reintegrate whatever their ideal terms are, I think you get long-term loyalty out of that person. But very often, if I think about what I just say, in situations where I had teams with huge pressure, hitting a number and knowing if that person doesn't deliver, I have a problem, versus when you have somebody in a job that is not immediately having that pressure, which then begs the question, do you bring people back in high pressure situations, or do you have a slightly different process when you know this is about hitting the road running versus there's time to get used to the situation again?
So I can't help thinking, I'm going to come to you, Joe, because I think this is very much in your ballpark, that the UK has a productivity problem. We struggle, and I know this is something Richard writes a lot about. And it's funny, we've got some great people around the room here around management and leadership, and most people don't work for a good manager. And I remember Richard Saundry talking to me and saying, you think about where most people work, say they work in a bar or a restaurant, their manager has never attended a management or leadership training course. And that person is doing all the same stuff that we're all trying to do without any sort of support and training and coaching and stuff. They're just doing what they do. But we also have a massive problem at the moment where we're the only country in Europe that has failed to go back to pre-COVID levels of employment with people on sick. And that is a huge economic challenge for us. And then you've got to ask the question about the culture we create in general employment, which I'm kind of going to you, Joe, here around collective engagement and employment, that is different or wrong or isn't functioning particularly well, that's not supporting people to come back into work.
There's about 18 questions on that, Chris, so thank you for coming to me with those. But if I was to break it down, I suppose there's a lot of assumptions around that initial example. And if there is an issue with one person returning with one set of circumstances, I would guess there's issues with other people. Mm-hmm. This is not the first time that these symptoms are being exhibited, and therefore there's probably a question for the culture more broadly about, well, why do people feel like that? And what are the things that aren't being said that we need to then find out about? You mentioned Richard. Managerial capability, I would argue, I agree with Richard, is an issue in the UK for various reasons, lack of investment, priority of what over how. There's a whole historic piece I could go into, but that would take the rest of the podcast. But it's really interesting to hear then about some of the other employee resource groups that people have mentioned, because some of this comes down to collective voice, which is a big topic in the book, and how do people express themselves at work. And I've been doing some thinking recently around the difference between what's complicated and what's complex, and the world is more complex now, and that is definitely being seen in collective voice. Trade unions are at the lowest level of membership, really, historically, that they've been ever. Yet people have got a lot to say, and that is being channeled through other voices, and there's probably experiences from Oliver Bonas about how that is exhibiting itself, and that will be different in lots of organisations. But to have true dignity at work, you need to be able to have a say. Mm. If you're coming back to work and that dignity doesn't feel like it's being respected, then that shows in certain ways, and those symptoms, however they're coming out, will come out eventually, like all of our emotions.
I'm going to come to you guys because you guys are proponents of followership rather than leadership, and we did a wonderful episode talking about that. That's about voice, right? People having a voice and being able to bring that voice to the business. What's the lessons? What are the tips on how organisations could bring more people in to share that voice? Because we've heard a couple of comments about it's not just a manager's responsibility to manage this relationship. It's about colleagues, how colleagues engage them, support them, pick up slack where necessary, build flexibility. But that requires a sense of ownership, that we own our own voice and destiny and how we wield our culture.
Yeah. I'll say that it's about all of those things you've just mentioned, but I think one thing that's been missing from the conversation so far is the identity question. Who are we as a team? What values do we really stand for? And I think that becomes the jump-off point then for thinking about how we engage. If I'm thinking about someone who has been away from the team and has come back, and the point's been made already, they've probably changed. The team's probably changed. But as a leader, I'll probably be very interested in what is your parental identity now? And how do you think that still aligns with, what it is that we're trying to do, and, the collective shared values that, that we have shown or displayed or are very proud of as this team here. And I think the conversation that a lot of organisations don't have, or a lot of teams don't have, is how those individual identities actually align to or fit into, if you like, a super ordinate identity as to who we really are. That's the really interesting conversation. And, we've got to, as leaders, get better at helping people have that.
I'm going to come to you, Kelly, because I'm curious. You're leading teams, complex teams, and there's a lot of great ideas and conversations. What's on your mind when one of your team members is coming back from a parental leave? How much capacity exists in your organisation for your team to manage their team? To recognise there's layers of team management here. How easy is this?
It's not easy. I have a lot of women on my team, which is fantastic, and a lot of them have gone on maternity leave at one point or another, which I fully support. And, we always backfill, and when they come back, so as we were saying before, we have a phased return, and it's overlapped with the maternity cover. So they're not coming back on their own. So that's one thing that we do. It's almost a bit of a hand-holding transition. But I agree with, it's interesting listening to what everyone has said. I've written down a couple of really key things with the organization and the leadership. 100% it's both of our responsibility. That's what I think. It starts with the culture. It starts with everything that we've built as a company, but it has to filter through. And our people and culture team are fantastic at making sure that that anyone who goes off understands, what they're coming back to. We have kit days, which means that they're checking in, during the time that they're on mat leave, so that they can ask any questions that they want. They can participate in a strategy day or an away day or something like that. So they're still keeping up on what's going on in the business, and I highly, highly, highly encourage that. But I also understand if you don't want to do that, and if you want to focus your time, and that is okay. So there's a lot, I do have leeway, but it's also coming back. I think it's hard when you talk about the identity. Yes, their identity has changed, completely changed. And coming back with the exact same expectations, impossible. So I think that's something that as a leader we have to understand. And again, going back to initially what I said about having the conversation, that's the first thing. I don't expect somebody to come back at 100%. I don't expect it. I have seen people come back at 100%, but I don't expect it. And we take our time with the phased return, and then thereafter, we still have those conversations, have an open dialogue. What's going on? How are you feeling? Can I do anything to support you? It does get a bit challenging when you start talking about the team support, because I think that there can, dare I say, a bit of resentment from some team members that don't have children. And just in terms of, the additional support that this person might be getting as having children, that's something that I have to manage. That's something that people in culture have to manage. That's not their problem. That's ours, and I recognize that. So I guess that's kind of how I approach it. And again, it's constant communication, constant,
Interesting. I'm going to come to Maria, because Maria's just had a baby and she's very much in this position. So maybe I'm opening up a can of worms I don't want to open up here, but curious in your thoughts on this.
Feels interesting to be on this side of the microphone. But yes, hello, I'm Maria. I'm the podcast producer, and I'm so passionate about this topic, having recently returned to work after maternity leave, and it's been fascinating to hear the other perspective in the room, the leadership, which obviously I am not. So I work as an actress, and one of my first telly jobs back after during maternity leave actually was a job for ITV called Code of Silence, which was a really great gig. And we went back to shooting. It was my first day back. I was already feeling a little uncomfortable. I'd been out of the game for a while. My body felt and looked differently. You know, there's all of these hormonal changes that are going on. I'm still sort of on the verge of breastfeeding. There's so much to consider as a woman going back into the industry. And there's this need to impress and to the fact that you have become a parent not be the reason for when things go wrong or why you may have got brain fog and haven't quite remembered the line in the moment. And there's this real need to impress and go beyond to make sure that it's not an excuse and a reason for why I'm not performing in that moment. And I remember we'd shot all day and it was a really long day and we'd gone over schedule. And I remember when I first accepted the job, looking at the schedule thinking, okay, great, looks like I'm going to be done by lunchtime. That'll work well for nursery pickup. My other half at the time had the neurovirus, so it was quite literally just me that could do the nursery pickup. And as we were edging closer and closer to 6 p.m, I was starting to get really nervous. We'd wrapped on my scene, and then the first AD, which is the person in between the director and the actors who kind of passes information over, came up to me and said, the director would love to have you in the next scene. You know, do you want to stick around and sort of be part of that? And in my head I was thinking, oh my God, what an opportunity to be in an extra scene on this TV show. You know, back on maternity leave, it would be something extra to put on my CV. It would be more footage for my online reel. And then I was thinking, but I can't, because Ezra's waiting for me at nursery. My other half has got his head in the toilet with neurovirus. What an opportunity that I've just missed. And I remember being so flustered in the moment that I didn't tell the first AD why I can't say yes to this opportunity. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, but I've got to get home. There is a reason. And then things moved so quickly on set. He was like, yeah, no problem. And then I was just ushered off back to costume to get undressed. And I just remember absolutely kicking myself on the way home, being like, I wish that I'd just been more open, I think, in that situation and just explained my circumstance. And maybe I wouldn't have walked away thinking, oh, that director's not going to want to work with her again because she's not willing to go above and beyond, you know? So that's what I'm putting out into the room, and I'm so curious to hear from everyone around the table, like what advice you would give someone in that situation, and is it something that you've seen before as well?
Why did you feel that you couldn't speak up?
Because I just didn't want it to be an excuse for the fact that, you know, the nursery run, the fact that I've just become a mother, I didn't want that to get in the way. But I do see now, upon reflection, that if I'd just been a bit more open and honest about it, you know, I wouldn't have had this constant questioning in my head of if they think I let them down kind of thing.
And that's the sense of feeling like, I think what Joe said earlier on about not being up to the performance of the team. So I'm not going to use my child as an excuse why I can't deliver it. And there's an interesting thing that Kelly said, which is people feeling like they are using, you know, other people saying, or they're using an excuse as their child, why they get to knock off at 5:30 and I have to stay picking up the pieces. All of this is symptoms of poor team culture, though, isn't it, Joe?
Could be down to poor team culture, but I'm not sure. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think there's so much. I've been on maternity leave 3 times. My partner, he stays at home, looks after the kids, and I think one of the issues is that us who are slightly older, we think, well, we managed it. You can manage it too. When we're not the most sympathetic, I think sometimes as leaders, I think this is generally what happens. And you think, well, I muddled through and had 4 months off and came back and did this and look where I am now. I managed it okay. You can do the same. And I think we need to stop that. We need to say, well, actually, that was hell. There wasn't any way of doing it. There was no process. There was no structure. It wasn't about the team. They loved me coming back, apparently so. I don't know if I can speak for them. But we muddled through. But that's not fair. I don't expect anybody else to muddle through because of that. But I think there's so much ingrained in organisations that it's difficult to start from a blank sheet, from this is the ideal. I think we have to move things gradually.
And it brings us back to the employee voice.
Yeah.
I'd love to pick up a few things. I'm sort of joining the dots on a few things, and one of the things, or 2 of the things, Joe, that you mentioned were complexity and employee voice. And they really stayed with me because human systems are complex. That's it. We all have different experiences and different needs, and we're in there together. Generally, I feel people do the best they can. That is always my assumption. And I agree that the magic, the secret sauce is in employee voice. And Tony and I have done work together at different times, and what absolutely stays in my mind is when employees say, I feel seen, I feel heard for the first time. And what that unleashes in terms of engagement, performance, improvement is astounding. And I wish I could put a price on it. Maybe somebody who's more clever around the table can do that. So employee voice, I think, is the biggest resource that organisations have and often overlook. And I do wonder about this link with complexity. Because as a manager, as a leader, Kelly, I thought you beautifully said, and I'm managing their needs and I'm managing the team needs. And actually that's how you describe seeing part of your role. And I often see leaders struggle with complexity and feel the need to have the definitive answer all the way forward. And Tony, when you talked about leaderful, is actually how much help resides within the team for that manager and leader. And then the last dot I need to join up is, yes, I've had 2 children. And, I look back and I think, well, was it unprofessional? No, because we did an amazing piece of work together. But after my first daughter, who took almost 2 years to learn how to fall to sleep, I would often meet my client. She would ask me how I was, I would cry, and we'd have a little conversation about it, and then we'd get on with the work. And we did amazing work together because she also had children that didn't sleep. So where performance comes from can be different. Again, complex.
And Chris, you guys are great at creating these networks. You're also running a business where people are dissipated. They're in retail stores. They're all across the UK. They're working flexible time or inconsistent time. They're expected to be on the shop floor or doing stuff on the shop floor. My question is, how do you do that? Because lots of companies come back and say, oh, the problem is it's just difficult to do. And you guys do it pretty well. I'm not going to accuse you of doing it perfectly, but you do it pretty well. And you've got so many, lots of organisations would consider logistical challenges around that.
Yeah, I would like to think we do it pretty well as well, but we definitely have our challenges and all of those things that you've just said. We've got people on night shift in our web fulfillment and warehouse populations. We've got stores that trade from, in our train stations, 7 a.m. until 9 p.m. We've got people who work flexibly. There is a real challenge, but I think that to kind of conflate that situation with what Maria was saying about filming a scene and clearly doing such a good job in it that she was asked to stay back. So in effect, she was asked to do overtime, and Maria had to implement a boundary there and say no. And this is what's really important, is about creating that space that people can say no, and they also don't need to give a reason. It's whether or not is that right to switch off, right? It's being able to set that up and say, I've done my bit for today. I've done my quota, and I need to step away from it. And to sort of create a parallel to the challenges that we have with creating these networks and things, is accepting that not everyone's going to join a Teams call for an hour of our Black and Mixed Heritage Voices network or our LGBTQ plus Voices network at 2:00 on a Wednesday if they don't work at 2:00 on a Wednesday. And it's not because they aren't engaged or invested or want to be part of that network. It's because they also have a life outside of work as well. And that's totally cool.
So how do you manage that then? So how do you engage people in a network that they can't be in? How does it not become just a clique of a few people who turn up?
It's about varying the channels and varying when they meet. So I'm saying Wednesday at 2:00, but actually we might say, hey, listen, shall we do a 7 o'clock on a Sunday and have, we could all just have a drink over Teams. Someone could do a quiz. Why not? Something that's a little bit more sociable in that respect as well. So varying the times is definitely one of them. Utilising different communication methods, whether that be a group email that perhaps the nitty gritty, the more meaty conversations, or sharing articles or sharing suggestions or feedback on things, maybe policy or process that we have that people want to share. And then also having like a WhatsApp group for people who, want to just share like who watched Adolescence on the weekend, or, whatever that sort of water cooler moment is.
And where did it come from? Did it come from the voice of the groups feeding up to the management, or did it come from the management saying we want to establish these groups and we want to implement them? Because this is something we talked about around kind of collective voice and how to establish it. Where did it come from?
I mean, for us, it came from implementing what was initially 4 networks to now 8 that have been created by the teams who wanted to create them. So when we implemented them, we had our Asian and mixed heritage voices, Black and mixed heritage voices, LGBTQ+, and disability and chronic illness. And now we have neurodiverse, parent and carer, and growing bolder. And that sort of expanded, just because the team have an appetite for it. So it's kind of a bit of both, really.
Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts, Joe, in terms of, I know this is something you advocate a lot of engaging groups and bringing group voice together. How would you do it?
It's a really interesting question. Where does the voice come from? Because not all retailers are probably as conscientious as Oliver Bonus in that they're not really interested in voice, but they have mechanisms that are performative. But when there's a disagreement, they're not going to take any notice of that employee resource group. Thank you very much. We're going to do what we want anyway, because there are no sanctions, because they're not in a trade union and they can't take strike action. I could carry on, but there is a point here around what is that real dignity at work? I would argue that's probably not, because they're not really listening. There's voice, but it's not being heard. And Maria talked very eloquently about actually there's some big structural issues in that industry, which is probably designed by men, for men, and doesn't take account of the different needs that exist in the world and the different identities and demands that are placed on people. So there's all these other massive issues going on. And how do you deal with that? You have to have a conversation about it. And it sounds like Chris is talking about his experience at Oliver Bonus. They're doing that well, but not everyone is. And that has massive knock-on consequences. And I think Maria is saying, the fact that you felt you had to give a reason for why you couldn't be there is probably part of the underlying issue around some of the structure of that industry and how it works. And Equity do a great job.
They do. I am a member.
But there are issues, I think, in that industry and others that mean that there is a lot of precarious employment, and that drives a whole nother series of behaviours and doesn't create an environment where you can have trust or high performance or genuine engagement, I think.
And empathy is very important, and trust has come up a couple of times in our conversation around I want to have a trusted conversation with this person who seems disengaged. But pick up your point, Joe, of as a male leading a team, am I credible for somebody to sit down and say, I understand your guilt for leaving your child? Now, I have children, but somebody might not feel that I'm the right person, because it might be, well, of course, it's easier for men, or you don't have the same situations that I've been in. And it's not that that's untrue, but if that's a perception that that's untrue, then that's exactly the challenge that they've got to face, to deal with. And so there's this kind of it wasn't, it's not my problem because I built the system to suit me, structural challenge, which I think can get in the way of some of these trusted conversations. And I think that's much harder to fix, because that requires us to really step outside of our comfort zone as a manager, as a leader, and really try and empathise. And it's funny, the point of we muddled through. That's so hard to deal with, because, in my mind, it's very much like yes, I empathise, but there's a point where I draw a line and say, at what point do you just need to get on with your job and get stuff done? That's not the right thing either. So it does become quite a difficult balance because, as a manager of a business leading tasks, functional operational tasks, how much does your personal life, get in the way? And I kind of go, leave your personal life at the door and let's get on with the job. And that's a hard one to drive because you say when people come to work, they are both. They are the personal and they are the operator at work as well. And I think these are all really difficult questions to try and resolve. Do we have credibility as men when we have these conversations?
I'm going to throw that back at you and say it's not just men; it's women that don't have children either. So it's both of them. It's not just men that are in that bucket because you don't understand the situation that they're in.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
But I think the same could go for any protected characteristic or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't have children,
but
I appreciate it must be difficult to retransition back into work after a lot of time off. I had a long time off 7 years ago, and there was a transition period coming back to work for that. But that was a different struggle to someone who didn't sleep for the first 2 years of their time on this earth. But the same, you don't have to be everything to realize it's difficult for a gay man in a predominantly hetero sort of boardroom, or that woman there, or someone from a minority background, or whatever, a disabled person, whatever it be. You don't have to be all of those things to sort of understand or appreciate that there's challenges that come with that. You won't know what those challenges are, but you can accept that they're for sure there.
That comes back to the empathy, doesn't it? It comes back to the empathy, the trust that you're building, and the relationships you're building with your teams, and it starts there so that they can trust you to understand where they're coming from, even if you haven't had those specific experiences. And that's for men and for women and for non-heterosexual, anything, and anyone who doesn't have children. I mean, we're all kind of responsible for that, for understanding and being empathetic. I love what you said, the seen, heard, and I'd add the understood into that, because that's really, really important across the board.
One of the things that strikes me just listening about this, and it's come up from the thinking about retail, is, I'm disengaged because before I had a child, I was motivated, and now I don't care as much. And it's funny how now I see that as a problem. We actually started this conversation saying this is the problem. The problem is they're disengaged. And is it because they seemed to be not fully motivated in meetings, not the same level of enthusiasm we were used to? I didn't say at one point that they're not hitting their goals, they're not doing what they should be doing. And it's funny how we have these expectations. And I was thinking about the workforce we have. My oldest kids have got, they're in the workforce and don't care as much as I did at 24 about how much their career matters to them. They've got other focuses in life. We've got lots of people now who love multiple jobs. Maria has multiple jobs. And so there's expectation of how much blood I get from someone. And their kind of attitude is, well, you pay my bills, but my real passion is to be a YouTuber. And, how much do we focus on trying to get them to be 100% committed to us and my job, because this is the most important thing in the world, versus really understanding that I'm a means to an end for them.
You could say, Chris, shouldn't that be the default?
Well, yeah.
And actually, work is what we do to be able to live the rest of our lives and do everything else. And there's probably some assumptions and education that exists, almost brainwashing about why work should be so important. And I think there's a lot of people that I am connected with in my wider network who are like me, freelancers who never want to go back to having a full-time job again because of the flexibility that it gives you.
Yeah.
And so there's a real balance there in managing some of the insecurity around income and things like that. But I think there are some definite challenges around people's conceptions of work and how important that is. And just one very quick story, I worked at London Underground. Back in the days when you used to have to apply to carry on working beyond 65, for anyone who remembers those days, there were lots of people who just wanted to carry on working because that was their life. They worked on Tufnell Park Station for 25 years. That was them. And when we said, no, you're not going to work at Tufnell Park Station anymore, they were devastated. And it was horrendous to have to sit through meeting after meeting where we were talking to these people, and that was a huge part of their identity. And I used to think to myself, I never want to be in that position where work is such a huge part of me, but I have no control over it.
So there's a phenomenon that's happening now, and I was talking to a hypnotherapist friend of mine who really characterised this really well, that there are many people in work today, executives, whose whole identity comes from their job, and it comes from they have a gold card at their favorite airline because they fly around the world on business trips. They when they post on social media, they get hundreds of thousands of likes because they work in a big organization and they're kind of seen as an executive. They get a car that picks them up from work. They get pension schemes and bonus schemes and stuff. They get an office with their name on. They're important because of their job title. And should they retire, suddenly that all disappears. And they're really struggling to retire. They can absolutely afford to financially, but can't because psychologically they're so wedded to the kind of status that comes with all these trappings. And they're saying that's a big problem for the workforce because then people are not retiring, they're not moving on, they're not creating space. You're not allowing younger people to come into leadership positions and evolve through. And so there's a kind of big knock on. So it's not just the guys on Tufnell Park Station at London Underground, it's people within leadership positions. And then that's got to have a knock-on effect about the motivation of why we do things. And I read something during COVID about the biggest winners for the people who wanted to work from home were experienced senior executives. They already had a network of people that they could call and contact. So they didn't have to make friends and relationships at work. They already had them. They had 25 years of them. They lived in a house which was big enough that they had a spare room that they then turned into an office, and actually quite enjoyed the fact that they could get up, walk the dog, go for a cycle, go for a run, and just go and work in their office. And the people that didn't have those facilities were the ones who missed out. They didn't have a chance to build a network. They didn't have a chance. And it's interesting because it's that kind of perspective of empathy and understanding and kind of really understanding the individual that influences decision making and welcoming people into a workforce or making people feel like they're excluded from a workforce because you're not as committed as I am to the cause. Fascinating, isn't it?
It's difficult because if I think back when I started working, my parents were in my ears. You need to start working straight after university, first job, very important. Try to go to a big company, no gap year, no travel. And I was mega committed, and I worked in my first few years to 9 o'clock in the evening, and I loved it. And then you have a generation, now the generation of my daughter might look at it differently.
Yeah.
And if I, as a leader, am there, and I thought because it was that way when I was brought up, and that's the way to go, you got a problem. Because I will then project my experience of little Andy to the person who comes in now. But I will struggle to get that out of me. So as an organization, how are you an intermediary to recognize that maybe the new generation looks at things differently? good, bad, or whatever.
Yeah, and the person coming back from parental leave says, actually, I care less about this job than I did before. I've discovered YouTubing, and I'm passionate about my channel that I've now developed as a new parent, and that's my real energy and focus. And I don't care as much about this, and that's our problem. We've got to wrap this up. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I want to just get some final reflections on your thoughts to deal with this situation, this challenge. What are your takeaways from what you've heard in this conversation, or what final contribution would you make advising people listening to this episode on things that they should think about, things that they should consider? Andy's keen to go.
I'm keen to go because I had a thought listening to Kelly earlier, and there wasn't a good time to bring it in. So now is the time to bring it in. At the very beginning, we talked about, is a line manager responsible for the reintegration? And then I suggested the organization has a major part to play. I think you talked about the maternity cover. So I'm thinking about a triangle, because the maternity cover is the person who's there when the job was handed over. The maternity cover is there a year after when the team and the job might have changed. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, in this model, what can be the role of the maternity cover to make that integration easier? And so my hypothesis, it's a combination of line manager, organization, and maternity cover. And I'm not an organizational person, so it might be a bit basic, but that's my final thought.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, Andy. Thank you. Who else has got something to reflect on, some advice for our listening audience?
I can go. I think it's slightly linked, Andy, to what you were saying before about how you might see yourself at a certain age, having grown up years ago, and then relating to younger people coming in. And I think that stayed with me because I think it speaks to much of what we've been talking about this evening, which is the absolute importance of capabilities for leaders. And these aren't easy, but to understand ourselves, really understand ourselves, in order to be able to relate and understand others who may be different, who are likely to be different from ourselves in some way, and to be able to navigate that in different situations. And I think that self-other situation is something, as managers and leaders, we're holding all the time in one way or another. And so I would say, start with self. If we can do that work for ourselves, then we are more able to do it with others.
Nice.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts and comments?
That was too beautifully said.
It was beautifully said. So all it remains to say is thank you very much. That hour has flown by. It's been such a great conversation. So we appreciate your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Commercial Edge podcast. I'll be back soon with another episode. Join me then when we delve into more difficult conversations. See you next time.